that I've taken, the position that I've taken, I just prefer to stay out of the public eye, and been there, done that. But I took this position because I feel very strongly that we need to have a moratorium on gain-of-function research. I told you that the great pandemic is coming. I think it's going to come not from spillover. It's going to become from gain-of-function research or intentional bioterrorism, right? It's going to be a bird flu virus that is manipulated to be able to transmit human to human, very similar to what we saw with the COVID. In 2014, that laboratory published that they finally learned how to take their COVID virus and have it bind to the ACE2 receptor in humanized mice, and therefore it could go human to human. I mean, they did the experiments, they published them in 2014. And now we see that there's a COVID virus, which is, I think, has a number of signature sequences in it that aren't normal. The furin cleavage site, the fact that they use the nucleotide triplet for arginine that humans use, not bats use, the fact that COVID right now can barely infect bats, but can infect humans, should tell you that there's a lot of evidence that this virus was manipulated to be able to be highly transmissible among humans. I think it was done probably as part of the biodefense program that largely was trying to make a vaccine vector that would be used for good purposes. But unfortunately, that virus escaped, and it was highly transmissible for humans. And you saw from the time it escaped, which was probably somewhere in the September timeframe. You remember in September, that laboratory did three things. They changed the management from the military, civilian to military. They deleted all the sequences of the viruses, and they put a contract in for a new ventilation system. That's about the same time they began to see some illness in the area. So I think that's when the epidemic started. And I do think the gain-of-function research moratorium is something should happen. It shouldn't be decided just by scientists. I happen to be a scientist, but we shouldn't decide this ourselves. There should be a broader debate of society whether this research needs to be done or not. Tony will argue it needs to be done. Collins will argue it needs to be done. I think that debate should happen. And if the answer for society is we need to do the research because the potential good is greater than any harm, then we should figure out how do we do it in a safe, responsible, and effective way. But right now, this research is being done in university laboratories all over the world. And again, I'll go on record, don't like to say it. My parents were scientists. It hurts me to say this. But I do believe that the most likely answer when we get to the truth is that this pandemic was caused by science, not by a natural spillover event. Clear, because Tony Fauci and I have been colleagues and friends for over 40 years. I do believe that Fauci and Collins are working in what they believe is in the best interest of science. I happen to totally disagree with them. They are strong advocates of gain-of-function research. I'm a strong advocate for a moratorium on gain-of-function research because I do believe it's very probable that this pandemic was a direct consequence of science. I do think you're right that there's a strong interest in protecting their view, protecting science, that is protecting gain-of-function research, and thereby trying to shift the debate that this obviously didn't come from the laboratory, this obviously came from nature. And that's really the push. Secondarily, and I don't blame the Chinese lab per se. The reality is the U.S. government funded this work. NIH funded it, USAID funded it, the State Department funded it, and the DoD funded it. So the United States funded the research, and the scientific community, largely in America and Europe, fostered the gain-of-function research, which was the basis for which this virus came. Tony's right that prior to gain-of-function research, the only way new pathogens came in to the human species was spillover. But now in the presence of gain-of-function research, where you can take a pathogen into a laboratory and change it, then no longer does the species barrier really define the event in humans. It can actually come. And I do believe the next pandemic, and we're going to have another pandemic, and I think it's going to be the great pandemic. I consider COVID a minor pandemic. The great pandemic is going to come, and normally it would come from spillover. It's going to be bird flu that learns how to transmit to humans and then go human to human. But I think the species barriers are very real, But it's much more probable that it will happen because of gain-of-function research in a laboratory and then escape, and then we're going to have a pandemic with flu, which will be much more brutal to the world than COVID was. As if there's a strong bias, in my view, towards trying to promote the spillover hypothesis rather than having what I consider an honest scientific debate, where I've always said, if people prove that I'm wrong, I thank them because then I learn something. If you prove to me that I'm right, I'm not as thankful because you didn't teach me anything. This should be a scientific debate, and it hasn't been. It's been a geopolitical decision for a single narrative, which is unfortunate. And as I said, is antithetical to science.
And Dr. Redfield,